The mountain was silent, but silence never meant peace in those parts. It was the kind of silence that made a man grip his rifle tighter, the kind that whispered of ghosts and shadows hidden in the pines. For years, Caleb had lived with that silence, a solitary figure among jagged peaks. His cabin stood like a scar against the wilderness, weathered by storms and time. The townsfolk called him a ghost himself, a mountain man who spoke to no one, carrying grief in his eyes and fire in his beard. But even a man hardened by loneliness could not prepare for the sight that met him that morning. As dawn broke over the ridge, Caleb's eyes caught movement on the roof of the abandoned mill. At first he thought it was just a tattered piece of cloth, flapping against the wind. But then he froze. His heart slammed against his ribs. There, hanging by her wrists, was a woman, her golden hair catching the sunrise, her dress torn and stained with blood, and carved into her skin with cruel precision, burned deep enough to blister, were the words, "Apache lover." If you believe in kindness, second chances, and the power of humanity to rise above cruelty, then please pause for a moment, like, comment, share, and subscribe to our channel Stories collection. It helps us bring you more stories that carry meaning, hope, and strength. Caleb's breath came ragged as he climbed the creaking beams of the mill, every step cracking beneath his boots. He untied her with hands roughened by years of chopping wood and hunting game, yet gentle enough to cradle her as though she were a fragile child. She was barely conscious, lips dry and cracked, her skin burning with fever. He carried her back to his cabin, the weight of her body strangely light, as if the cruelty she had endured had already stolen half of her spirit. For days, Caleb sat by her side, spooning broth between her lips, changing the cloth on her wounds, whispering words he hadn't spoken aloud in years. She drifted in and out of fevered dreams, sometimes murmuring in languages he didn't know, other times crying out in terror. And when her eyes finally opened, wide and blue as the mountain sky, Caleb saw the raw fear in them. She recoiled, trembling, as if expecting another lash, another jeer, another firebrand pressed into her skin. But Caleb only lowered his gaze and said nothing. Silence, after all, was his truest language. The story of the branded woman began to unfold slowly. She had been born to settlers, but her heart had found its home with an Apache man. The town called her a traitor, a disgrace, a woman unfit to walk among them. When her lover was hunted and killed, they dragged her before the crowd and branded her for all to see, leaving her to die as a warning. She had escaped only to collapse in the wilderness, until fate had brought her to the loneliest man alive. Caleb knew what it was to lose everything. Once, he had a wife, soft laughter filling his cabin, a baby's cry echoing against the rafters. But one winter, sickness came, and the mountain kept its silence as his family was buried beneath the snow. Since then, he had lived with nothing but ghosts. And now here she was, broken but breathing, a reminder that even shattered lives could still burn with quiet strength. The nights were the hardest. She would wake screaming, clutching her scarred body, while Caleb would sit nearby, unable to banish the demons in her mind. But over time, trust began to flicker like firelight between them. She saw how he never turned away from her scars, how he treated them as if they were part of her story, not her shame. He saw how her smile, fragile and rare, could bring warmth to the cold cabin walls. Together, they began to stitch life back into each other, piece by fragile piece. Yet peace was not meant to last. Word spread that the branded woman had survived. The townsfolk whispered of sin and shame, and soon, riders came. They came with torches and anger, demanding Caleb hand her over. The mountain man stood at his door, his rifle cradled against his chest, his voice low but steady. He told them that she was under his roof, under his protection, and that no man would take her again. The mob spat and cursed, but they saw the fire in his eyes, the fire of a man with nothing left to lose but his honor. One by one, they turned away, their hatred swallowed by the darkness of the pines. The days that followed were not easy. The woman, Eliza, still carried the weight of her scars. She flinched at every crack of wood in the fire, every echo of boots on the porch. But in Caleb's quiet strength, she began to see something she had lost long ago: safety, and in Eliza's will to keep breathing, despite all the cruelty she had endured. Caleb saw something he had buried in himself: hope. They rebuilt the mill together, plank by plank, not because they needed it, but because it gave them purpose. And as spring crept into the valley, the sound of laughter, hesitant at first, then real, began to rise again from the lonely cabin. Caleb no longer spoke to ghosts. He spoke to her, and through her, he spoke to life. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you of the strength that lives even in brokenness, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to Stories Collection. Your support helps us keep telling stories that matter, stories that heal. And before we end, special request: share your thoughts in the comments. Tell us if you believe that love and kindness can truly rebuild even the most shattered lives. The mountains had a way of swallowing sound. No bird sang, no creek babbled, no wind stirred in the valley that morning. It was the kind of silence that pressed against a man's chest and made his breath come shallow. The kind of silence that reminded him he was utterly alone. Caleb had lived with that silence for 10 long years. His cabin was little more than wood and stone nailed together by grief, perched on the edge of the pines like a forgotten memory. The townsfolk had stopped calling on him years ago, whispering that he was mad or haunted or both. Caleb didn't argue. He simply stayed, because the mountain was the only place that didn't ask him to explain his scars. But fate has a way of disturbing even the deepest silence. As dawn crept pale over the peaks, Caleb saw it. Something strange on the roof of the old mill down the ridge. At first it looked like cloth tangled in the beams, swaying against the pink light of morning. But the longer he stared, the less sense it made. The shape was too heavy, too fragile. His heart jolted, and with rifle slung over his shoulder, he trudged down the slope. The closer he came, the clearer the horror grew. Hanging by her wrists from the rafters was a woman, her body limp, her hair golden as sunlight, matted and wild. Her dress was torn and bloodied, her skin blistered by cruel fire. Branded into her flesh in jagged, burned letters that still glowed angry red were the words, "Apache lover." Caleb stopped dead in his tracks. In all his years, he had seen cruelty, Indians slaughtered, settlers turned savage, neighbors turning on neighbors. But never had he seen hatred carved into the living body of a woman like this. If you believe in kindness, in second chances, in the power of humanity to rise from the ashes of cruelty, pause now and help us spread these stories. Like, comment, share, and subscribe to Stories Collection. Because together, we keep hope alive. Caleb climbed the rotten beams of the mill, his boots scraping against the wood, his heart hammering in his chest. He cut the ropes that held her and caught her as she fell, her body frighteningly light in his arms. She was still alive, though barely. Her lips cracked as she tried to whisper something, but only a dry rasp escaped. Caleb pressed a hand gently against her hair and carried her back to his cabin. For days, he nursed her as he would a wounded bird. He boiled water, made broth, cleaned her wounds with hands more accustomed to chopping wood and setting traps. Each time she stirred, he was there, waiting. At night, when she cried out in her fever, Caleb would sit by the fire and whisper words he hadn't spoken in years. Words of comfort, words of faith, words he once used for a wife and child buried deep beneath the snow. When her eyes finally opened, wide and blue as the mountain sky, she looked at him with terror. She flinched from his touch, expecting more pain, more cruelty. But Caleb only bowed his head and stepped back, showing her that he was no jailer, no tormentor. He was only a man, alone, scarred, and perhaps just as broken as she was. Her name, he learned slowly, was Eliza. Once, she had been a settler's daughter. But her heart had strayed where her people said it must not. She had loved an Apache man, and when he was hunted down, the town took their revenge on her. They branded her as shame, tied her to the mill, and left her for the wilderness to finish. Caleb understood loss. He had buried laughter and warmth in shallow mountain graves long ago. And now, holding this shattered woman in his cabin, he felt something stir inside him he thought long dead. Purpose. The purpose to guard, to heal, to stand between cruelty and the broken. The mountain was silent again. But now, in that silence, two wounded souls breathed side by side. And slowly, very slowly, life began to stir once more. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you that even broken lives can find light again, please like, share, and subscribe to Stories Collection. It helps us bring you more stories that heal and inspire. And before we end, special request, drop a comment below. Do you believe love and kindness can rebuild even the most shattered lives?